Good morning. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Spring Forum season. Dr. Russell Jeung, professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and a leading sociologist of race, religion, and social movements, was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people of 2021 in recognition of his work launching Stop AAPI Hate. Stop AAPI Hate is a US-based coalition dedicated to fighting racism and discrimination against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. As the nation's largest reporting center tracking anti-AAPI hate acts, the coalition works to create a safer, more equitable future for everyone. Jeung, who learned to integrate social activism and faith as a community activist in his East Oakland's Murder Dubs neighborhood, asks difficult questions about longing and belonging, wealth and poverty, and how living in exile can transform your faith. Today, we're going to be talking about vital issues for us: immigration, inequity, and taking faithful action. Russell, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so grateful to have you.
Thanks for having me, Malcolm.
Your book was such a page turner. I absolutely loved it. I just couldn't wait to get to the next thing. And I enjoyed it so much. And it's just such a faithful witness, too, of how faith in Jesus can really change our lives and really move us in new directions. I really appreciated it. But some of the most powerful stories in the book are about your family's California history, 5-generation history. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what some of the events, the most important events in that history, family history, were in terms of influencing your own family's culture.
Oh, yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So happy Mother's Day. And actually today they're having a walk of remembrance in Pacific Grove, California. That's right by Monterey. And that's where my great-great-grandparents settled in the 1860s. They settled there and they became abalone fishermen, and later on, because Portuguese and Italian fishermen pushed them off, they had to start fishing at night. And so they actually realized that if they held burning embers above the waters, that squid would come up like moths to a flame. And so they would just scoop up all these squid, and they did really well being squid farmers or squid fishermen. And my great-grandparents lived there my great-grandfather then moved in 1882 there, and they lived there for 4 decades. But the anti-Chinese sentiment at the time was so horrific that, in California and the West Coast, 168 Chinese communities were just mass dispossessed because of mob violence. And that came to Pacific Grove in 1906 when they were actually living on Pacific Improvement Company land. That's Stanford University, his land leasing company. Stanford's company evicted them. And when the Chinese wouldn't leave, the manager at the site said, "We have to get rid of them by any means necessary." And so a week later, this mysterious fire erupted in the village, and then the water lines were cut off mysteriously. And so the entire village burned down, and over 200 people, including my great-grandparents and my grandfather, were mass displaced. And when they tried to return, Stanford put fences around the place. They put up armed guards. And one person actually had one of the first sit-ins. He tried to stay on the property, but eventually they all left. And because of that, my great-grandparents, again, who had businesses, homes, raised their families there, they lost everything. And they had to move to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place of refuge from the racism. And after that, then my family was like 2 generations in poverty in Chinatown's ghetto. And I think
it's almost like becoming immigrants again, and losing everything, being completely cut off from everything that your family had worked for all that time.
Yeah. And I think that really shaped my family's sense of belonging in the U.S. when you're excluded in such a way, when you're relegated to a small ghetto, when like they always say in Chinatown, if you cross Broadway Street, you would get beaten up. So.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about how your parents told you about, how did you begin to put the pieces of that puzzle together? Because it wasn't just that. I mean, even when you talk about what life was like for your Southern California family, I mean, those two are horrible stories.
Yeah, a lot of families don't talk about their historic trauma. Who wants to talk about those negative things? I don't like talking about Oscar Grant, or I'd never want to see, the Fruitvale movie, because I live right there and I experienced it. So my family barely spoke about the Monterey story. It was only because I was interested in my family history and I began to read up on what happened to Chinese and what happened in Monterey that I learned about it. And then when I was leading, so my grandfather, he wanted to bring a bride back from Hong Kong. And because Chinese were seen as illegal aliens at that time, the only way he could bring over his bride was to prove he was an American citizen. And because of the laws, his parents' transcripts, his parents' testimony didn't count. And so he needed to find 3 white witnesses that he was actually born in Monterey and he was an American citizen. And so they found these 3 witnesses. They came to Angel Island, they testified, and then my grandmother and my grandfather had to answer 56 questions in alignment, or else she would have been deported. And so, so that experience, that's how I knew about my family history, is because they kept INS records of exactly what they said, of, like, how far away was your house from the family farm, and how many steps did you have to make?
Wow, that's just extraordinary. I mean, every time I go to Angel Island, I see those buildings, the processing centers. I just think of people like your family. And what a crazy thing to be there when they've been in the country for so long.
Yeah, but my family's experiences are not unique. You think, oh, well, that's an amazing family story, but no, that happened to all the Chinese. They all got mass dispossessed. They were all mass detained in Angel Island. They were all mass separated because of policies and segregation.
Yeah, and it's had a lasting effect and continues to affect their lives now.
Yeah, it does, again. And actually, that's why I'm interested in Asian American studies, because, I'm 5th generation, and yet when I was growing up, I went to Chinatown every week. I went to a Chinese church. I was wondering, why are we still so Chinesey when, according to American assimilation policies, we should have been a lot more acculturated than we were. And I realized, because of our history, because of policies and legislation, because of stereotypes, my family grew up in a certain way.
Yeah, definitely. Could you tell us a little bit about just like what your experience was like at Lowell High School? Like, what did you learn there, and what it was like then, as you went to school with your friends from the neighborhood?
Oh, Lowell, I would sing the song if I knew it.
I know we have someone here who could.
Yeah, Rebecca. We're having our 45th reunion this year, so please come out. Lowell, so while I was growing up, I grew up in the Richmond district, and my family was one of the first Chinese families in the Richmond district. But as I was growing up, because of the Immigration Act of 1965, Chinese began to move into the country, and Chinatown people were able to buy homes in the Richmond. So our neighborhood really shifted from being a white neighborhood to a pretty multiracial neighborhood. And by the time I got to Lowell, I think it was probably almost half Asian.
Yeah.
And so I grew up in a very Asian American subculture where we would listen to African American music. We listened to K-Soul.
I did too.
Yeah. Oh, did you grow up from the?
Will and Davis.
Yeah. And my friends were all Asian. They were Filipino, Japanese, Koreans, but we only spoke English. And so that little subculture of playing basketball, listening to a certain kind of music, riding Muni all day, wearing derby jackets was something I knew was like, oh, this is a distinct subculture that I was proud of, that I felt really comfortable in. But whenever I left the city, it's like everyone's different.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was a change of time of such change, and you're right. I mean, it's just like almost like Chinatown moved out to Clement Street, and still is. We still have the remnants of what, even though the city's changing so much all around us. One of the things that makes your story in At Home in Exile so powerful is just as a testimony of your faith. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like how your faith has changed from your childhood faith to your adolescent faith to your more adult faith.
Well, I hope it's deepened. I grew up in a fundamentalist church where we took the Bible literally, and so did I. And so when I read that there was neither Jew nor Greek, male or female, I go, why do we then have a Chinese church, right? Why are we segregated in a different place? When Jesus said, blessed are the poor, or I was hungry and naked and you fed and clothed me, I was wondering, why didn't the church do that? And so if you just, people always ask me, so I grew up in this very fundamentalist church, very pietistic, very personal faith. But then when I read the Bible, there's all these passages in the prophets and about Jesus caring for the poor. And I go, why aren't we, if we are taking the Bible so seriously, why aren't we feeding the poor? And why aren't we being among the poor if they're the blessed? And so I wanted to meet Jesus in those ways and to follow scriptures in those ways. And so I kept on sort of, I grew up really progressive in liberal San Francisco, growing up in the 60s and 70s. And I grew up very conservatively Christian in an evangelical fundamentalist context. And all through college and in my young adulthood, I was trying to, how do you integrate these two perspectives? How do you seek justice and equity in the U.S.? How do you follow Jesus faithfully? And I think over time I've been able to hopefully integrate some of those ideas and to live out my faith, I think, where I really do still want to follow scriptures and to meet Jesus and to also, for me, there was a song we sang in the 70s called Seek Ye First the Kingdom of God.
Yeah, we sing it too.
Yeah, it's a great camp song with echoing and so I go, okay, if that's the thing we're supposed to do, seeking God's kingdom first, God's righteousness, I just saw that, well, this world really isn't right. I worked in Chinatown and saw how immigrant workers worked so hard but couldn't get out of poverty. My family, we would go see shows at the Golden Gate, but we'd walk through the Tenderloin and we'd see people sleeping on the streets, and it just bothered me. And that's not right. And so if we really wanted God's kingdom of righteousness, then we had to make both our personal relationships with God right, but we also have to make our relationships with each other right. And now, increasingly, we have to make our relationships with creation right. And so some of those tenets that I had growing up stayed with me, and they're just sort of, my faith gets expressed in different sites. But I think I'm still trying to pursue, I think, the call that we're all called to.
Yeah. I mean, that was what struck me so much. I mean, this is a book about a person's ministry. I mean, this is about ministry. That's, if I had to summarize it all in 3 words, that's what I would say. I think too, as you come of age, we do have to balance all these contradictory parts. But it is so clear what Jesus' teachings are, and I think that gives us a lot of direction, a lot of help as we try to discern what it is that we should do.
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, hopefully, I don't think the book is as much as my ministry, but my wanting to see Jesus and see how God moves in different places. Whether it's my ancestors and their story of dispossession, whether it's refugees who I live with and their stories, or even now in our current political context, how is God moving? And so hopefully my story isn't about me, but it's how I've been able to meet Jesus in all these places. And that's such a gift to, even in the darkest places, that's where you see God's grace and God's power.
Yeah, that's so true. When you graduated from college, you went off and you taught English in China, and you did that for like 1.5 years, 2 years. Could you talk a little bit about what you learned there? And now, you hear all this rhetoric in the press about the tariffs, and I mean, what China is constantly part of our consciousness. So what did you learn as a young person that helps you understand and contextualize, what's happening in terms of the trade questions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So China really is vilified now, and it's deemed America's greatest threat, both by the Department of Defense, by our administration. But when I was there, this was pre-liberalization, when it was really still more communist and socialist. And it was just a real simple life back then, because they had no TV shows, they had no shopping, and so there really was nothing to do except for to hang out with people. And I just loved it. I would just go on long bike rides, I would hang out with people, and I would just read a lot. And I realized then, and this was early on again in my life, that I didn't need all the stuff in America to be content, but I could be really satisfied with a simple life. And so I tried to maintain that sort of value that I grew up with since then. So one quick story was, Back then, everybody was wearing those Mao suits, and there were, unlike America, where people always have mirrors to, look at yourself, they had no mirrors in China. So I would just wake up and I'd go like this, and like put on my clothes, and I'd be all sleepy-eyed, and I'd go to my classroom, and everybody looked exactly the same, and they all had bedhead too. We all looked like ugly, but we were all perfectly happily being ugly looking because we all looked the same, and we didn't notice how we looked, right?
Yeah.
And then for spring break, during Lunar New Year, I went to Hong Kong, which is a bastion of capitalism, and there were mirrors everywhere, right? And plus, they had not only mirrors where you could see yourself, but they had Asian models. So in the US, all the models were white, and so I didn't relate to them, so I didn't care about white models. But in Hong Kong, all the models looked like me, but they were way better looking than me. So I would look at the Hong Kong models, and I would look in the mirror and go, geez, I need to buy hair conditioner and, skin toner. And I realized media really shapes our needs and our wants and our own self-image. And so just shifting from this place where you're just sort of like in your own little bubble, just hanging around with a bunch of ugly people who look like you, to going into this world where everybody is, glamorous, I realized then, like, I'm not going to watch any TV, then I wouldn't feel so dissatisfied with my life.
Yeah, right. It is the media consumed does generate dissatisfaction.
Yeah. And so since then, I've tried to stay away from a lot of media, although, with phones now, you're saturated with it. So.
Yeah, it's hard to get away. Yeah, it's.
Does my hair look okay now?
Yeah, you look great. You look great. You're doing really well. So, Berkeley, I want to hear so much more about what your experience there was like as an intellectual. What teachers influenced you? How did you decide to do the work that you did in terms of your academic studies? How was that?
Yeah, Berkeley was a great place for me. I liked it so much that it took me forever to finish my PhD. And at that time, Robert Bellah became my advisor, and he was a leading sociologist of religion. And he wrote this book called Habits of the Heart about American individualism, and that really impacted me because it helped me understand America really is hyper-individualistic compared to a lot of countries, and that's really shaping our sense of need and want, what we expect for our lives, and how we relate to other people in a very individualistic manner. And that really contrasted, again, with my Chinese sensibilities and what I saw a lot of other countries were like. So, and he wrote about how we need to really reclaim a lot of America's Republican virtues, civic virtues, to have a common good, to develop a sense of common good, which made sense to me because I saw, again, America so broken, American falling apart, but that there are good parts of America that we need to really relearn and then re-embody. And now what I'm writing about, just quickly, is I think immigrants today, and because there's such a period of xenophobia now, that actually immigrants embody the values that America needs. And if we need to, as you clearly see, we're so driven by greed and self-interest and violence that values of hospitality, values of generosity, values of social responsibility are Asian values that Asian immigrants embody. And if we could just learn from our neighbors here in the US and really, again, incorporate those values in our systems and in our institutions, and maybe then America could become a good society. So during Berkeley, I'm going to school, I'm learning about these theories, learning Marx, and and at the same time, I was studying Asian gangs, and I decided, I was working with Michael Buravoy, and we did participant observation, so I spent a summer living with gang kids. And this is in East Oakland, and Southeast Asian gangs were the largest gang during that period in the early 90s during the crack epidemic. And so I moved in with them, and I liked it so much that I decided to stay. And I haven't left for the last 3 decades, and I met my wife there, raised my kids there. And it's, how you, in scriptures, like you find a treasure in the field and you're willing to give up your life.
Exactly.
For me, moving into East Oakland and meeting my refugee neighbors and my undocumented friends and meeting gang members. That, for me, I was really meeting Jesus in those ways. And I go, why would I want to leave if you can meet Jesus there? And so I'm going to Berkeley, reading all this real theoretical stuff, but I'm living in East Oakland, understanding what it's like in the hood, what it meant to be a gang member, and again, tried to connect those two things.
You write about meeting Dan Schmitz as a kind of urban missionary, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about him and a little bit about what his vision, for things was, because you both were kind of brought there and on a different path.
Yeah, it's sort of weird. So Dan Schmitz, when I moved into Oakland, he was a guy also trying to meet Jesus among the poor. And so he was working with a group at a neighborhood center called Harbor House, and he was had a house cleaning business where he employed local neighbors. And he had a food pantry in his living room, and he had all these cats. And so I moved in, and I was moving in with this place with cats that were peeing everywhere, and people were coming in for the food. And we were in this really small, ghetto apartment complex. So Dan and I were living there, and he just really modeled for me, again, a life of prayer, a life of simplicity, and a life of giving to his neighbors. And so eventually, we stayed there for 10 years together in this place called Oak Park. And we had this, we got to know our neighbors really well. And eventually, it became a slum, and we organized our tenants for a lawsuit. And because our neighbors saw Dan living there and going through the same stuff that they did, we had roaches, they had roaches, we had electrical fires, they had electrical fires, we had drug deal. One time Dan woke up and there was like this homeless guy right next to his bed. And he goes, "What are you doing here?" And the guy goes, "Well, you were welcoming me before." And he just walked in. And then our neighbor said, "Oh yeah, we saw some guy climb through your window." And they go, why didn't you do anything, right? And the neighbor goes, "Oh, we thought you'd do that all the time," because he was so welcoming to our neighbors. So Dan lived there for so long, and the neighbors trusted him so well that they all joined in on the lawsuits. We got over 200 Cambodian and Latino neighbors to join in this housing lawsuit. And normally those groups don't work together. Normally those groups would be afraid to deal with the government. But because Dan earned the trust of the neighbors, they were willing to go along with us and sue. And that became one of the largest housing law settlements at the time.
Yeah, I mean, reading about it was so powerful. That section was, I think, my favorite part of the book. Oh. But maybe you could talk a little bit about just like, how, what's happened since. Like, because you were meeting, almost half the time has passed since the immigrants first arrived when you met them to now. And what have their lives come to be like? And, what's happened since you wrote the book?
Yeah, so when I'm studying gang kids, a lot of them, so we tried. How much time do we have? This might take a while.
Yeah, it's okay. This is the reason we're all together.
We tried everything to help these new refugee kids stay in school. And so we tutored them, and we created a tutoring program. We created a reading program for their parents, because if the kids saw their parents learning, then maybe they would be learning. We would visit their schools, open houses. We would go, to their graduations. We would reward them with tutoring trips. But almost all the boys dropped out, despite all our efforts. And that just showed us how powerful the gang life was at that time, how lousy the school system was, and how traumatized the families were from the war. And so, but over time, when we sued our landlord and they got better housing, that actually really helped the families, because then the kids had places to study. And instead of just hanging out, the kids were forced out of their apartments because it's so crowded, and that's how they would join street life. But once they were inside their own bedrooms and playing video games and being like other American kids, and they actually did better in school. And so some of the kids at Oak Park went to San Francisco State, where I teach, and we would carpool together.
Yeah, right.
And so some have done pretty well. Others are are working and having families. I've officiated some of their weddings, and but they're not. At least they're not getting deported now, and they have, they're not in gangs, and so I guess that was the impact.
Yeah, huge impact. You, in the book, described meeting Joan, your wife, during that period of time, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just your advice for people who are first getting started in relationships, and then people who've been in relationships for a long time.
Well, Joanne, I don't think she would say that we were the model family or couple. Can I tell you? We have a lot of stories about being newlyweds. I think for us, we just really share, again, that desire to meet Jesus wherever we're at, to meet Jesus in our service. So Joanne's a doctor. She worked in an Asian health clinic working with low-income communities, and now she's at UCSF. And so I think our prayer life and our shared life of ministry, our shared church life have really been bedrocks for us in wanting to keep that rhythm of a simple life, almost a monastic life, in the midst of, again, really busy lives, busy careers, but also, again, in a neighborhood that's really impoverished and needy, in a nation that's really broken. And so my kid grew up every day hearing, "Do you hear what Trump did today? An idiot," right? And so that's sort of like his breakfast prayer. "Do you hear what Trump did today? Idiot." And so I think that kind of context and having to deal with the world as it is something that we sort of team up against.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And you both share such basic fundamental values too. And that's so important, I think, in building relationships and that last. I didn't realize until I was talking earlier this week with someone that you'd worked on a documentary about the Oak Park experience. And I wonder if you can talk about just like making a film and what you learned in doing that, and what were some of the challenges, just like artistically, in terms of putting that together.
Yeah, so what we wanted to do is tell the Oak Park story, again, from the perspective of our community neighbors. And so we did it in Spanish, we did it in Khmer, and we did it in English. And we wanted to interweave the stories of Dan, this white guy from the suburbs, called Saul, a Cambodian guy who went through the killing fields, and another neighbor. But it's really hard translating and understanding what they were saying, because I didn't understand. So my neighbors would tell these stories about life in Cambodia, and they sounded really horrific. And I go, "Oh, tell us how you felt about it," right? Because in movies, you always need this emotion, strong emotion. And he said, "I did tell how I felt about it," but we couldn't tell by his facial expression because that's the cultural difference. He was a sort of pretty Buddhist, calm and placid, and so he was telling this horrific story, telling about how grieved and pained he was to see his fiancée get killed by the Khmer Rouge. And we didn't even know when he was talking about it that's what he was talking about. Yeah. So conveying that cultural differences, conveying expressions, conveying idioms across language was really difficult. But I think that's the story of Oak Park, is that we had these communities that were so different mindsets coming together that... and to try to make it one story, that's the cool part of the story. Just quickly, our Cambodian neighbors, they would get possessed by ghosts, by spirits all the time. And I had no clue what was going on. So one time they said, "Hey, Russell, can you help us get rid of the ghosts?" And I go, "What are you talking about," right? And then it's like, is it something lost in translation? And I had, what's going on? And then the next day they show up at my door and they say, "Hey, we're ready to go." And I go, "What?" And they go, "You have to drive us down to Long Beach." And I go, "Why?" They go, "They get rid of the spirit." And I go, "What are you talking about?" Right? And it's like, because I don't speak Khmer and they don't speak English very well. But anyway, when you have a grandmother and a grandfather and this paraplegic person and then this possessed girl, you can't say no to them. And so I drive down to LA with them. And
other people could say no to them, by the way, but you couldn't say no to them. Long Beach is a long way.
Well, what's funny? They had a Cambodian healer, and he was playing this huge boom box that was doing Buddhist chants to get rid of the spirits. So they buy a headdress to offer to the spirits, and they do the offering thing and the depossession. She comes back, and then the girl's back to normal. Before she was really sort of spacey. And so apparently the exorcism worked. But then I talked to some Asian mental health people. They go, oh, she was probably abused. So when you get abused, you get into this disassociated state, and you act in culturally scripted ways. Because I saw her dancing to no music in this Cambodian way. So the question is, like, why was she acting in such a weird way, disassociating and dancing to no music? And the Cambodian explanation was, well, clearly she was possessed by spirits, and the Asian and the Western mental health perspective, oh, clearly she was abused, and she was acting out of her cultural scripts. And so I realized, well, I have no idea of this Cambodian worldview, of how they see the world, of what explanations they have. So I gave up trying to study Cambodians and gang kids, and but that's part of the movies that, like, our worlds are really different, and yet we're coming together here in the United States. And again, how can we learn to live together and learn from each other? And for me, in this polarizing time, how can we live in harmony together?
Yeah. Even as I was riding my bicycle here this morning, I was thinking about coming to talk to you and just how much the stories of your family have enriched my life in learning about them. And yeah, that's America. That's really the purpose of this, I think. Mm-hmm. We all want to be better writers, and I've told you before you came in just how funny. There's so many sections of the book. I wrote little like smiley faces in the margins, and for the first time in my life, I wrote a double smiley face in the margin. But you deal with student writing all the time too. Like, what advice do you have in terms of like writing? Like, how did you perfect that, and how do you grow in learning how to express yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm still learning myself. I think I write for my younger self, and hopefully I've acquired some wisdom and some humor, and this is what I would want my younger self to know, and then maybe possibly my kids. And to the extent then that is interesting to other people, then I think if I can make myself laugh, then I'm just, that's good enough. Well, I don't even need to be published. The process for me helps me organize my thoughts. Making myself laugh is pleasurable enough. So for me, that's why I sort of write, just to, again, clear my thoughts, make myself laugh, and then write to myself, and then if it gets published, it does.
Yeah, that's really a helpful way of looking at it, imagining that audience. The section that you wrote about just like the graffiti, people like crossing out each other's graffitiing and then writing bigger graffiti, and then even just your description of just like the Lord of the Rings part when you and Joanne met, just one of those little side comments, and we were both wearing green felt or something like that. But anyway, there were so many times I just like laughing, and Heidi's like, "What's going on over there?" But I really appreciate that.
Well, it is a stream of consciousness sort of side, humor.
Yeah, exactly. So I was talking to Garrett Shin, who's teaching us Tai Chi at Grace Cathedral, and we're so grateful to have him. And you guys don't know each other, but he was talking about getting Asian American studies started at San Francisco State, just as an activist when he was a young man. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. I mean, San Francisco State in particular seems like such a historic place to be doing ethnic studies, and maybe you can tell us how it came into being and became such a leader.
Yeah, it's a real honor to teach at San Francisco State because, as you probably know, it's the birthplace of ethnic studies. And students in the 1968 strike, they joined the Black Student Union and they joined the Third World Liberation Front to come together to engage in the longest strike in U.S. history, a student strike. And because students were so revolutionary, they wanted their education to be relevant. And for them, which I think is really remarkable, they didn't see education as a means for upward mobility for themselves to get out of the hood. They wanted their education to be relevant so they could return to their neighborhoods and improve the conditions for their families, to deal with the housing, to deal with the health issues, to deal with the education. And so a lot of them I've taught with, they're still in the program when I started, and these strikers were just remarkable people with a vision for education. And the whole idea of community service learning, I think, came out of that ethnic studies model where we're supposed to go back and use our education for others. And so that's why I'm honored to teach there. That's why I try to still do the thing. That's why we created Stop AAPI Hate, because we saw what was going in the community, And the students and I just wanted to respond to, like, how can we help our community at this time? And even yesterday, my students opened an exhibit at the Chinese Historical Society talking about Chinese laundries. So in ethnic studies, we're always, we see ourselves as part of the community and bringing the community into the school and having the school go out into our neighborhoods. And so there are Dorothy's here from Africana Studies. It's just a real honor to be part of that legacy that I think San Francisco State is known for.
Yeah, it definitely is. When you think about like where Asian American studies are now, what are some of the pressing questions and what are some of the advances that are being made in your field?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Asian American studies, I think, has really developed over time. Theoretically, the Asian American community has really diversified. So when I was growing up, again, there were like core groups like Chinese and Filipino and Japanese who grew up in low-income neighborhoods and ghettos and Chinatowns. But now, since 1960s and 1990 Immigration Acts, the community is really diversified economically, by ethnicity, by religion, by generation. And so the old ways of understanding Asian American experiences are needed to be developed. So now we have a lot more transnational studies to understand the relationship between Asia and the US. We have a lot more global empire studies to understand how America acts as an empire to go colonize other nations, and that's why we're here. We're a bunch of colonized people who are brought here to be laborers for this empire. And so theoretically, the field has really has moved, but then I think, again, we still want to be rooted in our communities and seeking to empower issues. Again, that's why Stop AAPI Hate is created. That's why we want to deal with issues like immigration and mass incarceration and mass deportation.
Yeah. And then, I don't know how connected you are to the American Academy of Religion, but maybe you can talk too about just that part of your academic work too. Your life of faith and your academic work are connected.
Yeah, so I have all these worlds, right? I'm living in the ghetto, and then I live among academics, and then I work on the policy level a little bit, and get to join here, which is sort of cool. And the American Academy of Religion is this really body of scholars, and I think the way they all connect is I think the scholars there too, they really understand how America as an empire has used war, has used its instruments of violence to extract resources from places and from people, and try to think about that theologically. What's that say about our nation? What's that say about us as a people? What's that say about our human nature? And I think for me, it's been really helpful to go to these academic places and to learn, but then take that analysis and see what's that have to do with real life, and how can we then make changes in our structures? How do we make changes in the ways we talk about things?
Yeah. And one of the practices we have is we take notes from our audience. So please, if you have any notes or questions, we'd be delighted to gather those up. So Stop AAPI Hate. We had members of our congregation who felt very strongly about this. We're very upset about what was happening, especially to elders here in the city center. But could you talk a little bit about just where that came from? And I imagine when you were born, your mom wasn't like, oh, my son's going to be on the 100 most influential people of the year list. But where did that come from, and how did it meet the needs of that moment? And what is its ongoing life too?
Yeah. So when we first heard about COVID in China and realizing how dangerous it was and how it will spread, I immediately thought of SARS, because I knew Asians back then were blamed for SARS, and people would unconsciously, if you're coughed while Asian, people would just avoid you. And so I was just on the lookout for that. I was primed for that. And I began to read the news, and increasingly I saw more and more accounts of Asians facing discrimination because of COVID. One stark story was a person in Sydney had a heart attack, but no one would help him because he was Chinese, and they thought he had COVID. So I began tracking news accounts, and it was clear across the nation and globally there was anti-Asian hate increasing. And so I worked with some nonprofits, Chinese for Affirmative Action and the AAPI Equity Alliance in LA, and said, we got to get the government to keep track of this, because it's government's responsibility to safeguard the health and safety of people. And so we actually approached the Attorney General at the time, but they said they couldn't track, they didn't have the capacity. So we created our own website. And who knew about this brand new website? But then once we opened it, we got hundreds of stories every day, and they were just horrific. I was just galled by how people are like spitting and throwing rocks at people and like yelling at grandmothers. They were yelling at like grandparents pushing strollers, and they would stalk them, yelling at them. Go, who does that?
Yeah, right, exactly.
So we pushed out our reports, and because we had the data, and because people were beginning to film on their phones all these stories of violence, especially against our elders, I think that's what those two factors, having the data plus having the graphic video footage, really sparked this movement that went global.
Yeah, and where are things now in terms of that ongoing effort?
Yeah, so Stop AAPI Hate grew, and what's sad is we didn't know what the baseline level of racism against Asian Americans was, but now we've been taking national surveys ever since the pandemic, and it hasn't subsided.
Yeah.
So over half of Asian Americans last year said they experienced a hate incident. It's either been normalized or we've always experienced this level of hate and we just didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
Now what's terrifying now is that you had the anti-Asian hate because of COVID, but now we have all this anti-immigrant sentiment, right? That all immigrants are criminals or they're eating cats and dogs. So, and then plus, all this US-China antagonism. So these factors, I think, exacerbate the anti-Asian hate, plus along with all these old stereotypes, we're the yellow peril. So the hate has continued, and it's actually become legitimated in policies now. So over 40 states have passed alien land laws that Chinese can't buy land. In Texas, they just passed that this week. They're resurrecting the Chinese Exclusion Act, so there's legislation now to ban Chinese international students from coming. They're using the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which they used to incarcerate Japanese during World War II. They're using that now to deport people, from Venezuela. And so policies today are actually making anti-Asian hate and violence official.
Yeah.
It's legit. It's our American policy.
Yeah. I think about that so much, and I wonder, this is kind of a tough question, but these first 100 days of the Trump administration, years from now, what do you think we're going to be looking back on and remembering about this first 100 years? Because it has been shocking.
It's the American nightmare. It's a real constitutional crisis. Will there be a separation of powers? It's a loss of constitutional rights and due process for people. But for me, America is so inhumane at this moment.
Yeah.
And I speak for all of I feel complicit. So I'm not blaming the administration. We voted for it. Mm-hmm. And so we're all, as America, our nation, are separating families. We're deporting people where they never even came from. That's cruel and unusual punishment. There's stories of Chinese kids with brain surgery coming. They're American citizens. They have birthright citizenship, but because their parents were deported, they're not getting their health treatment. This is a matter of life and death, and we're killing kids. We're separating babies from their families now, and like, what nation does that? What's the moral compass for that? And so for me, it's a harrowing, tragic time. It's hard to explain, and it's hard to understand. But I think we have to see it. We have to keep our eyes open, or else, unless we stop it, then we're guilty of a lot of heinous human rights violations.
Yeah, it's really true, because we are all citizens in this society, and we're part of this together. There have been a lot of articles in the newspaper lately about Sonoma State and just its financial problems and cutting different programs. What's life on the ground like at San Francisco State, especially with these changes in the national policies?
Yeah, so our national policies, we're building more ICE detention centers, even in California. We're putting all this money into military parades for the president. At the same time, our educational systems are getting cut, right? Our health systems are getting cut. Medicaid might get cut. And on the CSU level, we're getting cut, and our enrollment is down. So like Sonoma State, San Francisco State is suffering through a lot of cuts. We've had to lay off a lot of lecturers. And so it's painful because our students really need the classes to graduate, need to learn. They need mental health services, and they're not getting them. And so it's a sad situation where public education, like, our values are sort of warped, right? That we value imprisoning people more than we want to educate people.
Yeah. What are today's students like? I mean, you started at San Francisco State in 2002, and there have been so many changes over time. What is the difference between like what students are like now versus what they were like back then?
Well, back then when I sort of understood them because I wasn't so much older than them.
age.
But now I'm way older than them. I have no idea what their worlds
right.
are. My students are running these theses on like EDM drug use, and I go, what's EDM? What drugs are they talking about? And they're talking about like, I'm going to look at all the Asian American pop music stars, and like all the classmates recognize all these names, and I'm like, who are these people? They're all YouTube singers. And I'm like, I have no idea. So what are students like today? I don't know because I'm in my own bubble as well. But what I do know is that they want to learn. They want to support their families. But in the Bay Area, like a lot of us know, it's a really difficult time in terms of housing costs. They all work 30 hours or more just to help their families. But they also have a lot of mental health issues, which is really sad. And so more than ever, even Asian American students you think are supposed to be stoic, model minorities, they're sharing in class their mental health struggles of the pain, the anxiety they have. And I think if you're not anxious in the moment, then you have a mental health issue. Like, why aren't you anxious? Like, anxiety should be a natural response to what's going on. So I think our students are in a really difficult position right now, having to juggle work and family and their mental health struggles that are really real.
Yeah, all that is very helpful, because you're right. I mean, just the pace of culture has changed so much so that you're right. The YouTube, like the idea that you'd watch someone on YouTube for music, like I didn't even get that until you just said it.
Yeah.
And then you're right. I mean, just the ramped up like cost of living and the anxieties that we all feel about the environment, and just how hard it is just to keep your head above water.
Okay, here's one really big difference is I wrote this book about Chinese American families. I said, families are really important.
Right.
That that's sort of our religion is the family. That's where we get our identity. That's where we find purpose in life. So I asked my students today, and this is mostly Asian kids, like, how many of you guys plan to have a family? And only like 2/3 say they want to have a family, and 1/3 don't want to have families. I go, why don't you want kids? And I go, they're too expensive. I go, wow. And it's true, but it's sad that we think of kids in terms of how much they cost, like the price tag of kids. And it's just, again, sort of foreign to me to think about having to think everything's a commodity, and are these babies, like, I got to weigh, is a baby going to cost me more than having a dog, And so, but that's in some ways shaping their thinking. I can't criticize their thinking, but I am shocked because I'm so old school.
Yeah, and I think part of it is just, we always heard about like late capitalism, that expression, and you just think that things can't get any more individualistic or capitalistic, and yet they continue to do so.
Yeah, and that's how we think of immigrants. What's their cost to a country?
Right.
Rather than, and then how much does it cost to deport them? And it's like, we're only seen as costs or how much we contribute. And I don't think of grandmas in terms of how much grandma's cost, to keep grandma well, or how much grandma contributes. I want my grandma to be with me, and I hope Americans would think of people in the same way as family members, as neighbors, not as costs.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a basic breakdown of our understanding of what human dignity is. Mm-hmm. All right, so here's some of our questions. Oh, this person wrote such nice, large handwriting. I'm so glad. What is your response to people who criticize the existence of Asian American, African American, any hyphenated studies versus just studying American as one body of studies?
Um, that's a really good question, because now there's a whole movement that's, actually, again, there's now an official American policy that's anti-DEI, against diversity, America is against including people. America is now against equity. That's our official policy. And so because of that, the state of Indiana, they quit teaching ethnic studies to their kids.
Wow.
So these policies are having real impacts on what's getting taught. And what I say to that is, I don't want to criticize people for their political views, but I just want to share my perspective, is that white kids are victims of racism.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that again. White kids are victims of racism, so Trump and Republicans should be happy. But the reasons why they're victims is because they're not learning the whole history of America. They're not learning about what African Americans and Asian Americans have brought to this nation and have enriched this nation with. And because they're not taught and they get a whitewashed history, a whitewashed English class, they lose out. They lose out and they don't learn to develop empathy for others. They learn to then, it's okay to deport people. I think that's racist to teach kids how to be inhumane.
Yeah.
I think it's racist to continue intergenerational trauma in that way. So we have, white kids are victims of institutional racism, just the way black kids and Asian kids face institutional racism, because our educational system and what gets taught is very one-sided if it's simply an American history that excludes people of color. So what I would say to people is, like, I don't want your kids to grow up racist. I don't want your kids to be victims of racism. And so what they need then is to be educated in a well-rounded way where they can learn the stories of a range of people to understand a history that explains why America is the way it is now. Not a history that you want it to be, but a history that explains, why is America deporting so many people? Why is America incarcerating so many people? Why does America have so many unhoused people? Why doesn't America provide health care? And if we learn history that explains why America is, it's like my question, why are Chinese still living in Chinatowns?
Yeah.
I want history and school to teach kids how to understand these things. And then, if they didn't get a non-racist education, then maybe they could be more empathetic, maybe they could be more human, maybe they could be more compassionate. And so that's what I would say to people who say, we just need to teach American history. We don't need all this ethnic studies.
Yeah, and it's so important to understand the truth, too. I mean, to not grow up in a world where the existence and experience of so many other people is hidden from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, like, I never knew my family's story. Like, who knew that 168 Chinese communities were dispossessed? Like, I would never know that, except for I experienced the trauma still generations later. But you figure out, why am I so angry? And it's like, oh, maybe it's because of this past history.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember, I mean, like the Great Migration for African Americans, like no one explained that to me. Like I had to learn that as an adult somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's such, like the most basic thing, like a experience of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's like, why are people living in this neighborhood? They didn't just come for the American dream. There's something that kept them from their dreams in their homeland that drove them to America.
Yeah.
There's people who brought them here so that others could have the American dream, and we could work so that they could have the American dream. And so, yeah, basic questions like, who's my neighbor and why are they here?
Yeah.
Can be taught.
Yeah, so true. Okay, do you think that, this is another question, do you think that racism played a part in Kamala Harris's loss at the polls last November, particularly in communities that are not well integrated? And then the bottom says, go Lowell.
Yes. Yeah. I think yes. It's so clear to me that because she was female, because she was African American, because she was South Asian, she didn't get as much support as she needed. And again, you could see the backlash in terms of policies. This is what America wants. They want to get rid of immigrants. They want to incarcerate people. They want to not support other nations in developing countries. And so I think all that is racist. And so I think the election, a lot of what America does is racist. And again, it may not be an intentional prejudice, but it's just part of our system. It's like we look out for ourselves, and if that means harming other groups, that's okay because we're in our own little bubble.
Yeah, that there's people who are on the inside and people on the outside, and we only are responsible for taking care of the people on the inside.
And let's build a wall so that we're safe inside.
Yeah, we had a guest who talked about the number of border walls that have been built around the world over the last 60 years, just how there's been a proliferation of those. Okay, next question. In every aspect of our lives, we are being expected to do more with less. How can we best utilize any time and resources to address Asian hate when we are concerned about groceries and living costs as opposed to quality of that life? We're just trying to survive.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, survive and take care of yourself. And I don't blame people or expect people to be, full-time activists. It's a real privilege for me to be a professional Asian American and to talk about it and to be Asian and to act Asian. It's also an honor, especially during Asian Heritage Month, to celebrate my family's culture. So how do you balance the wanting to be civically engaged with your own personal life and your career? I think again, this is what I learned early: is it takes discipline, and you need a lifestyle of simplicity if you want to do what's important. So it's up to you to prioritize your life. If you think exercise is important, you'll make time for it, right? Whatever your God is, you'll make time for it. If spending a lot of time on the phone is your God, then that's your God, and that's how you use your time. For me, even though I work full time and I have a family, I still it's important to me to improve my neighborhoods. I work weekly at a community garden, and it benefits me because I get to be with my neighbors, and it gets me in the ground, and it connects me with nature, but it's just a priority. So I think people are really busy, and you just have to decide what are your priorities and then devote and make time out for what you want to prioritize.
Yeah, during the early part of the new millennia, that federal government was talking a lot about immigration policies, and Congress was unable to do that comprehensive immigration reform. What suggestions do you have about how to improve the immigration system?
First of all, again, if my thesis is that America needs moral renewal, and that we need to learn to view people not in terms of their cost and their benefits, but instead see people as humans, as family, and as friends and neighbors, and then create policies that way. I think that's the basis, is that our starting point is sort of off, right? And so if we could shift our discourse and our understanding of who Americans and non-Americans are, and realize this is a global community. We couldn't stop COVID coming across our borders.
Yeah.
And the climate crisis is global. We're not going to be able to wall off carbon emissions, And so we need to learn, again, that we're interdependent, and then base our policies on those sort of approaches rather than on America's first, we could wall ourselves off, and we're going to be okay for this particular moment. That's a real short-term thinking.
Yeah.
So if we could develop long-term perspectives on that, then immigration policy that's humane, that reunites families, immigration policy that recognizes the workforce needs of America and the economic needs to have a labor force to grow our crops, to take care of our families. I think that's how I would start, and I would give past decision. This is really dangerous. DACA students may all become undocumented by the end of the year. That means all these dreamers, it wasn't their fault. They didn't come to America out of their choice. They just happened to be brought here. They grow up here. They go to school. They're working. They're dreamers, but they're all going to get deported. So that's over 500,000 kids that we've educated that we're going to just deport. So I think, again, we got to shift our thinking to think about who gets to be an American and who deserves to be an American.
And it does remind me that almost all conversations about population resources have that racist element that's lurking in the background.
Yeah, yeah. So scarily, the administration cut refugee resettlement. So we heard of a 12-year-old Afghan girl about to board her plane to be reunited for her family after the war for the first time. But then, because the budget was cut and she was about to see her mom, the flight didn't take off. And so that family is still separated. A poor 12-year-old girl. At the same time, this week, we're having the first batch of refugees from South Africa come, white Afrikaners, because they suffer so much discrimination in South Africa. So these people are allowed to come in because they're fleeing persecution, but then this poor Afghan girl, because of the war that we were instigating, she can't reunite with her family. That's clearly, I don't know, wrong.
Yeah, and that's the setting that we're in right now. I can't believe it because the time passed like a blink of an eye, so we're out of time. But I wonder if you can talk about how you see God's Spirit moving right now.
I think, first of all, I see God's Spirit's grieving.
Yeah.
I think he's pained to see families separated. I think he's weeping that we see homeless encampments in our neighborhood and people having to live in such conditions. So I think God's Spirit is moving in lament with us and a lot of groaning and pains. And so I want to acknowledge the pain of the moment, that we can't quickly go to God's power and God's joy. So it's a dark time, and I think we do need to lament with each other and grieve. And I think, but God's Spirit also does bring joy, that God's Spirit also brings hope, that God's Spirit also moves in his people to raise up people for change. And it's not going to come top down, but it's going to be from the people. And so I see places like this and spaces like this. I see friendships and community gardens. I see people accompanying people detained by ICE. I see people standing up at rallies, and that's where I see God moving. And that's where I find both consolation and hope.
Yeah. Well, Russell, thank you so much for your work on the front lines. We're so very grateful for you. And we have just a few quick announcements. We have one more forum left in the spring season. Next Wednesday online, we'll be interviewing, next Wednesday, May 21st. I'll be talking to Scott McDougall, theology and ethics professor, about what makes Anglican theology Anglican and about being faithful in a complicated world. I encourage you to buy Russell's book, At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugees' Neighbors. It'll be in the back. We'll also hope you're welcome to join us for the Eucharist immediately after the church services at 11 o'clock. Again, thanks so much, Russell, for your generosity.